So it's great to be here, everyone. My name is Dr. Chris Tuell. I'm the Clinical Director of Addiction Services at the Lindner Center of Hope. I'm also assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry with the College of Medicine. I've been practicing mental health, practicing mental health with folks for 35 years, dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction. When I was your age or in middle school, the last place that I thought I would be right here. Because what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon is something that I've never talked about publicly. This past year, I probably presented over 45 some presentations throughout the country. I've been interviewed on national programs about addiction and mental health. I only bring that up because to show you where I'm at and how did I get there. When I was in middle school on Sunday nights, about 7 p.m. in the evening, a show came on called The Wonderful World of Disney. Typically a show about a dog finding a boy or a boy finding a dog, one of those kind of stories. But I never saw a single episode of that show. Because when I heard that theme music come up and I saw those credits start to roll, an overwhelming sense of dread and anxiety would fill my body. Because I knew the next day I would have to deal with my demons. Not teachers, but anxiety. Anxiety in the form of a speech impediment. You know, when you're a kid, you want to be no different from everyone else, really. You don't want to stand out. You just want to fit in, right? I developed this speech impediment and this stuttering, and it severely impacted my life, as you can imagine. Made me want to withdraw from people, embarrassed about talking out loud. I remember in class we would go around and read paragraphs of a particular story, and we would read them in order based on where you're sitting. And I would count which paragraph I would get and what letters I would struggle with, what sounds I would struggle with. Usually vowels, A's and E's, H's, consonants as well. And being very self-conscious of that. What will my peers think about me? Certainly with that came the fact that I'm different, being bullied or teased about that. So it's easy to withdraw when you're in a situation like that. I remember once we were asked to come up to the front of the class to talk about a particular project that we worked on. And everyone had to do it, right? You go up row by row and you talk about it. And so here I am talking about my project, trying to get the words out. And see, anxiety and stuttering feeds one another. When I hear myself struggling, it increases the anxiety. And when the anxiety increases, it makes the stuttering worse. So I'm talking about my project, trying to get out the words. Everyone's looking at me. And without even knowing it, a drool of saliva comes out of my mouth. How embarrassing. My only compensation was thinking, well, you know, saliva's clear, maybe no one noticed it. I remember once, it was picture day, right? We have picture day, but back then, picture day was a little bit different. You have one shot. Today, right, you can get multiple pictures. You can pick the best one before they're printed. But back then, you got one shot, and you really didn't see what the picture looked like. There was no monitor to show you what the picture was. And so like all good photographers, they will have a word for you to say to get you to smile. And it happened to be a word that was difficult for me to say. So in that moment of trying to say that word and struggling with the anxiety and the stuttering, the flash went off. Capturing my face in that moment of showing anxiety and fear. And that was my school picture, one that other students had access to, one that I know for sure I never cut out and gave out to people. I remember thinking, why does this happen to me? I remember having that conversation with God. Why can't I just be like everyone else? Why do I have to struggle with this issue? Anxiety and depression affects many of us. A lot of us have normal anxiety, day-to-day anxiety. A lot of us have normal depression. But for some people, it does become very problematic and out of control. Anxiety is that fear of something that might happen, expecting something to happen, coupled with fear, anxiety, worry, expecting the worst to happen, depression, a sense of hopelessness. And I have to admit, at that time, when I was struggling with this, I was thinking, I don't want to live with this. If my life is going to be like this going forward, I didn't want to deal with this. Suicidal ideation is actually pretty common. But most people who have those thoughts don't want to die. They just want the pain to go away. The pain to go away. So in the work that I do in helping people with anxiety and depression, a lot of times it's looking at what are these different things that happen in their life. And it could be many things. As I mentioned, I work with folks that have addiction. And addiction becomes a great way, unfortunately, of trying to cope with anxiety or cope with depression. In fact, we see a relationship between mental health and addiction. Most people who have a substance use disorder also have a co-occurring mental health issue. That's the rule than the exception. So if I have debilitating anxiety and worry and depression, I'm going to try to find whatever I can to deal with it so I don't feel, so I do numb out. Unfortunately, these rates have increased in young people. 1 out of 3 teenagers will experience anxiety before they reach the age of 18. That number has been rising over the years. Depression, 1 out of 5 adults, 1 out of 5 teens will have depression in their life. How do they learn how to manage it? I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this relationship between addictive behaviors and mental illness, because they actually go together. And I think it's important today, especially because of technology. We all have access to phones. We feel that we're connected. But for many people who have depression and anxiety, it becomes a way that I learn to escape, to disconnect. I may feel I have lots of friends on my social media, right? A lot of followers. I'm connected, but really, it's a pseudo-connection. So let me talk about this relationship between addiction and mental health. And when I talk about addiction, I'm talking about chemical substances, drugs and alcohol, but also behavioral addictions that we're seeing more and more. I see them every week at the Lindner Center. Areas such as pornography and sex, gaming, gambling, spending. See, the brain doesn't really care what it is. It doesn't care if I put it in my vein, pour it down my throat, put it in my nose, or see it with my eyes. The same neurochemical process happens. And if I'm someone that has mental health challenges of anxiety, depression, grief, trauma, I'm going to find any way I can to escape from it. And unfortunately, something like technology is convenient. And for some people who struggle with these issues, it becomes a way that I cope and deal and disconnect. So let me talk about this. I call it CUBIS. It's an acronym for 5 things that show this relationship. The C, chemical imbalance. Some of us maybe have chemicals in our brain that are not where they should be. It's no fault to anyone, just part of my DNA. And because of this imbalance of chemicals, like let's say serotonin. Serotonin is a neurochemical that we believe affects our mood, our appetite, our sleep, our sex drive, our impulse control. But when that chemical is not where it should be, I'm more susceptible to depression and anxiety. And I find when I experience that anxiety and I smoke that joint, it gives me that balance. Or when I feel depressed, I look at porn or I game. And I find that homeostasis once again. And once again, it's no fault to who I am. It's just part of my DNA. It just runs in my family that I have this imbalance. Some people have unresolved issues in their life. Things that I don't want to feel, I don't want to think about. And whenever they come up, I'm going to try to find anything I can to suppress that. I don't want to feel that stuff. I don't want to think about that stuff. So I find whatever I can. That's when maybe I use the alcohol, the weed, the porn, spending, food to suppress that. Sometimes we have distorted beliefs. All of us here grow up with a belief system. How we see the world, how we see ourselves. It's made up of the messages we get from our parents and relatives, neighbors, teachers, coaches, clergy. But maybe some of those beliefs, especially about myself, are not true. Maybe I have a belief at 10 years old that I'm insignificant, I'm worthless, I won't amount to anything. And that belief stays with me into my teen years, into my adulthood. And it impacts my ability to form relationships, to develop trust, connection with one another. Maybe I have a belief that the only way I can relax or have a good time is to drink. Well, that's not true, right? You can relax and have a good time lots of ways. The I in this cubus is the inability to cope. Think of someone that's been a best friend to you. Maybe you're here with your best friend. A best friend is there for you 24/7. A best friend is there during good times and in bad, and you can always count on your best friend when you can't count on anyone else. Pretty good definition, right, of a best friend. Unfortunately, that's the same relationship that we have with the addictive behavior. It's there for me 24/7, especially this. It's there during good times and in bad. And I can always count on that chemical or that behavior to do what it does every single time, when maybe I can't count on people in my life. And now I have to give up my best friend, the drug, to get well. The drug has been there for me when I felt anxious, overwhelmed, dealing with trauma, dealing with depression. It took it away. But hopefully we would all agree that's not a healthy way of coping. And ironically, the area of the brain where drugs and alcohol impact the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is the same area of the brain where we develop meaningful, connected relationships. So it's not a big leap that my drug, my alcohol, my porn, my gaming is on par with my family, with my friends, with my partner, and sometimes over time, unfortunately, it becomes number one. And now I have to give up my best friend to get well. And then finally, the brain. We know more and more about the neurology of the brain, how the brain's reward system becomes hijacked by this behavior. See, our brain is wired in a way to reinforce behaviors necessary for our survival, like food. If food wasn't pleasurable, we wouldn't be here now. If sex wasn't pleasurable as a species, we would not be here now. So the brain reinforces behaviors that are necessary for survival by pairing it with pleasure. But guess what? Alcohol, drugs, behavioral addictions, they do that too. They also trigger dopamine. So what does that mean? Well, when that dopamine floods the brain and hits our rational, logical part of our brain, it shuts down. It no longer functions correctly. And when this happens, another neurochemical is released called glutamate. And glutamate has to do with a lot about memory and learning. And glutamate tells our brain two things about drugs and alcohol. It says, number one, don't forget it. And number two, go out and get it. Just like food. So because of this relationship that addictions have in triggering this dopamine system, shutting down our rational, logical part of our brain, releasing the memory chemical that says, don't forget this and go out and get it, the brain now believes, in our case, addiction equals survival, just like food. Now, we all know I don't need alcohol or weed to survive. I don't need gaming to survive or the internet to survive. That's true. But the brain thinks we do, and that drives this behavior. And if I'm an individual that has issues around anxiety and depression, I'm going to try to find whatever I can to help me cope, to help me escape, to disconnect. When I was a kid, I remember this one particular event that happened. Just a little thing, but it put some things in motion for me. It changed everything. I remember I was home during the summer, and my brother-in-law was home. He's a school teacher, so we had our summers off and just kind of played, right? So he was at my house, and he said he's going to run back to his house, call me in 10 minutes, and we'll go play basketball. Great. Well, of course, as you might guess, answering the telephone was anxiety-provoking for me. And as I mentioned, certain words were more difficult to say. Words that started with A or E or H sound. Well, what do you have to say when you answer the phone? Hello, right. So not only was this anxiety about answering the phone, but what I had to say was also difficult. So my brother-in-law goes home, says he'll call me in 10 minutes. 10 minutes exactly happens. The phone rings. It's my brother-in-law, Bob. I pick up the phone, I say, hello. It's not him. It's the wrong number. That little event showed something and put maybe a spark into motion. Because up to that point, I thought all this stuff that I had to deal with, I had no control of. That anxiety was just something that was going to happen to me. We even call it panic attack, right? It's going to attack me. But that realization or that aha moment showed me in that moment that maybe I do have more control, because when I was convinced that it was my brother-in-law, and I know this is a little thing, but it gave me the insight to see the possibility that I had some control of this issue. And that provided in me some aspects of just feeling stronger about who I am as a person. That distorted belief that I'm incompetent, insignificant, that was just a distortion. It wasn't true. Many times we are faced with these situations in our life, and the role of anxiety and depression and struggles that we have in our life that continue to affect us. But that little bit showed something for me. And from that point forward, just that little moment of that realization, and I'm sure many of us have these moments that we can take from. Carl Jung says, there are things that happen in our life, in our world, maybe a single event, and we are never the same person after that. One passion I had was theater. But where's the worst place for a stutterer to be? Up on stage with people looking at you, having to say lines on cue, right? That was a nightmare for someone in my situation. But I had that passion for it, right? It was something that I wanted to do. I remember my mom taking me and seeing a touring company of Fiddler on the Roof, and just how awesome that was. And so I managed my junior and senior year to try out for the musical. And in the few shows, I had some lines. And that gave me confidence. Also, other aspects of my high school year started to blossom as well. I lettered in 2 sports. I was scouted by Major League Baseball. I started acting. I went to Marian University in Indianapolis, was a psych major, wanted to learn more about how people are impacted by things that they do in their behavior. Those experiences made me stronger as a person, more confident. While I was in Indianapolis, I became a member of the Indianapolis Opera Company and have been in 35 productions, various musicals over the year, played Tony in West Side Story, Joseph in Joseph, an Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Thomas Jefferson in 1776, my favorite musical. But I never would have thought I would have been here. It was that aha experience what put that in motion. And we have these experiences with the people that we interact with. And that's why connection is so important. Connecting. The number of close friends that we feel that we have has dwindled since the 1950s. We've exchanged close relationships now with square footage in our homes. We can do a lot of our shopping and interacting by ourselves through the internet. We can go to Kroger's, never talk to anyone. So what I want to focus on this last part here are some things that might be helpful when you maybe struggle with anxiety, stress, that can impact your mood. Now, has anyone ever been to the beach? California, Florida, right? Okay. Maui, maybe, right? And if you think back at that time when you were at the beach, enjoying the weather, the sand being the perfect temperature as it form fits your feet, the gentle breeze in the trees, the clouds floating by. And if you were there, if we were able to go back to the time that you were there, and on the beach with you, we had a PET scan, a positron emission tomography. A PET scan is a type of device that when it focuses on the area of the brain, you can see activity in the brain. And we could see our activity of our brain in that moment on the beach. Red and yellow is more active, blue and purple is less active. We can see that moment being relaxed, calm, and peaceful. Now, if you're back in Ohio, let's say it's the middle of February, and the weather is horrible outside, cold, wet rain. My birthday's in November. Usually it's this cold, wet, nasty rain, right? But now, you sit at the foot of your bed, or you sit in your living room, and now you close your eyes and you visualize yourself back at the beach. You bring up the scent of the ocean, the puffy white clouds, the breeze blowing through the trees. And once again, if we had a PET scan there at the house with you and we could see your brain in that moment, it would be the same. Your brain doesn't know the difference between you physically being at the beach or you being in Mason, Ohio. The power of our mind to be able to do that. What a wonderful tool that we have. and how we can use that when we're stressed or anxious. Here's another one. Many times when we're feeling anxiety, our brain says we have to fight against something or get away from something, fight or flight. And in order to do that, the brain sends blood to different parts of our body to help us do that so we can survive. But many times people with anxiety feel that, but there's no particular issue that's going on that's causing it, per se. But if I take a ball or a rock or a quarter or a pair of socks and I pass it back and forth between my left and right hands, I'm activating both hemispheres of my brain. The right hemisphere, where emotion is, anxiety resides, and the left hemisphere, the more rational, logical part of my brain. And in that moment, when I'm feeling that anxiety and tension, I do this. It's called bilateral stimulation, passing a ball back and forth. You can also tap back and forth. There's a version called the butterfly, but most people, you probably won't do this, right? A little strange. But this bilateral stimulation can help you when you're feeling anxious and stressed and overwhelmed. We have many tools within ourselves. Our breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, can help us relax, right? So if you just pat, and actually I like it, this is a little exercise, kind of a fun little thing to do, just for fun, for kicks. We're going to create a rainstorm. So over here, I want you to do, as I come to your section, do exactly what I'm doing, okay? Very good. So if the only thing that you walk away with is that rainstorm thing, that's going to remind you of this, or this bilateral stimulation, right? The last slide I have here is a picture of a moth in a cocoon. And if you're walking through the woods and you come upon a moth struggling to get out of the cocoon, it's moving its little moth legs and moth wings, and you decide, I'm going to help that moth. I'm going to tear away at the cocoon, take the moth out, and go on my way. Well, if I do that, what happens to the moth? It dies. The moth needs the struggle to become what it needs to be. Back when I was a kid and I was struggling against anxiety, what I needed to do was actually embrace it. By embracing it, it allowed me to feel stronger because of that struggle. I remember thinking as a kid, what am I going to be when I grow up? What kind of job can I have where I don't have to talk to anyone? That's all I do now. Thank you for this opportunity in talking to you.